Hello and welcome everyone. We're excited to present on the important topic of rejection in professional life as part of the AACN Student Affairs Student Series. I'd like to have the panelists first introduce themselves and then we'll move into our talk.
My name is Chris Morrison. I'm a board certified clinical neuropsychologist with a faculty appointment in the Department of Neurology at the NYU School of Medicine in New York. I've been in the field more than 20 years now with that much experience and time spent doing clinical work and supervision, as well as have spent a good portion of my career doing governance and advocacy.
Hi, I'm Stephanie Towns. I am a clinical neuropsychologist and the neuropsychology training director at Yale School of Medicine. I have been in the field for about 6 to 7 years. And in addition to my clinical work, I have been highly involved in advocacy for students and trainees.
Hi, I'm Pamela Dean. I'm a board certified clinical neuropsychologist at the Cleveland Clinic in the Center for General Neurology. And I've also been in the field for 10 years. My time is largely clinical, including clinical supervision, and I've also played an active role in professional organizations and governance, as well as student advocacy. All too often, our field does not do a great job of dispelling this myth about success. Failure in our professional life is inevitable, and we all experience it, but there's so much stigma around these experiences and these professional rejections or failures. And we don't do a good enough job as supervisors of being transparent, and this can be for a variety of different reasons. Some of which can be because not everybody's comfortable talking about rejection, or it can be difficult for new supervisors or peers to be transparent with one another. For whatever reason, it can be very uncomfortable for folks to talk about their own professional shortcomings. However, if we aren't transparent about rejection, it can give students and trainees this false impression that success is linear, when we know that rejection and failure is part of this common experience. So in this presentation, we are going to be talking about how this impacts students and trainees, along with how this impacts you throughout the course of your graduate training, and then how we experience it, and importantly, how we can move forward from these professional rejections.
So first, we'd like to start with congratulations, success. You've gotten into graduate school. You're marching through the steps of your professional training to your goal of becoming a clinician, a researcher, academic, whichever. However, as you move through those early steps of your training, you are now about to inevitably experience failures. It's just part of graduate training, and throughout your professional life, there will be failures. So we'd like to discuss more about how to move through those those experiences through your professional life, and how you can meet those challenges, whether they be applications to training placements, submissions of research papers, or even grant proposals. Inevitably, there's going to be a few of those that'll come back not in your favor. So before we discuss our more broad steps to navigating these, we'd like to just share a few of our personal failures that happen to all of us, and it's important that we get comfortable talking about that. Dr. Towns, did you want to start us off?
Yeah, so I think one of the most memorable professional rejections I've had was failing to match for internship. And I think that experience really highlights something that I think is so common for trainees and students when we go through any sort of professional rejection or failure. And I just remember feeling so alone. I was the only neuropsychology trainee in my entire program, let alone in my class, who was applying for internships. So everybody else matched and I didn't. And I felt so alone, and it felt like this never happens to anyone else. And I was unique in my failure. And I think that's so important to highlight, because, you know, one of the things we hope to do just by hosting this talk is to make everyone aware of the fact that this is just a part of our academic lives. Rejection is not only a part of it, but it's kind of a necessary part. We rely on things like peer review, licensing exams, board certification exams. This is how we ensure that everyone entering the field of neuropsychology is qualified and ready and is providing safe and good services. But the unfortunate thing is that it also means that the trainees going through the process have to experience a lot of rejection, and we can feel really alone. And in particular, this is really salient for current trainees in a way that it wasn't for any of us panelists, because you all have the benefit and curse of the internet now, right? So, you know, when I can show some examples of when I signed on to Twitter on match day, medical match day, I saw all of these people announcing their matches or announcing their professional triumphs, announcing publications. And it's so wonderful to see so many people succeeding. But I also thought what it must feel like to be a trainee who didn't match or who just had a publication rejected, and to be constantly bombarded with examples of other people's success when no one else is really talking about their failures. So we're going to talk more about our failures.
So one of the things that really stood out for me was one of the reasons that really was the impetus for doing this talk was just as what Dr. Towns was saying, that sense of feeling alone in your rejection. And during my fellowship, during fellowship, one of the requirements usually is taking and passing the EPPP. And in my fellowship, it was during our second year. And as silly as this sounds, I was completely unprepared for the fact that I would fail it. I know that sounds completely, duh. We studied for it and everything, but it didn't really occur to me that I would fail it because no one was really talking about it at that time. And so I internalized it. I wasn't smart enough. Something was wrong with me. I hadn't prepared enough. So I studied and I took it again. And again, I failed it. And at this point, it was really starting to impact my confidence. At that time, I went to my supervisors, and it was one of the most impactful conversations that I had, because he opened up and shared with me his own journey of some of his professional failures. And it really helped me to feel not alone in that moment. And this really came full circle, because after I passed the exam, a friend from graduate school had come to me and shared that another student in graduate school, a mutual friend, was also struggling to pass the EPPP, and asked if I would be open to sharing my experience with him. And this was really the first time that I realized how much impact it could have on another person to share my own struggles and be transparent about how much I struggled with the EPPP, and that it wasn't really my own experience.
Those are terrific examples of sort of benchmark failures that we might have, big exams, big milestone training experiences that we need to achieve. I'd like to bring it to a bit of more of a micro level, the smaller rejections and failures that we might have during our training experiences. I can recall during graduate training, those early externships, learning to write reports and spending a lot of time crafting my report, trying to follow everything that I've been taught, and really spending far too much time probably writing these reports and turning it in, thinking I had submitted a really solid piece of work, and then had the supervisor come back. And in those days, it was literally a red pen. We didn't have track changes in the way we do now, but same principle, replete with edits. Just everything that I thought I had done good was revised and reshaped and reworded. And I thought, oh my gosh, I spent so much time putting that together. It's like death by 1,000 cuts every time you submit a report and get all of those edits back. It really can make you feel that you're not making progress. To make it worse, I would look at those edits and go, yeah, that really is so much better than what I had. Why didn't I think of that each and every report? But as time went on, you get a little bit better at each of those small rejections, if you will, small failures, if you want to call them that. They do shape you, and hopefully you're learning from each of those failures, both large and small. The other thing that we're going to encounter both during our clinical training and throughout our careers, probably one of the most painful rejections that we can experience as people who go into clinical work, is rejection by our patients. that is going to happen no matter what you do. You will have spent hours crafting a report, and through your training, you will think you have gotten it just right and trying to communicate that message in a way that you thought was helpful and sensitive and on point. And you go to deliver that information to the patient, and there is not just a rejection, but maybe even an aggressive or angry response. And that can just be completely defeating for a clinician who has spent a ton of time, many hours, trying to think of the best way that you can communicate your results, your feedback, your recommendations, and just to encounter that situation where it didn't come off the way you intended. I know I've done that many times. And it just even meeting the ire of your patients. And that can just sit right in your stomach and make you feel really badly because you had spent all this time thinking you were doing good and doing the best you could, and it just didn't come out that way. It's important to remember that that is going to happen no matter what you do, and over the years it will just continue to happen. We work with folks who come with very challenging backgrounds and combinations of diagnoses that will put them in a place that may not make it possible for anyone to reach them. But that rejection, nonetheless, it hits you right in the stomach, and it really, you can carry it with you for days and months. And some of these early failures that I had, I can think back very clearly to those sessions with those patients, and I can still feel how it felt when I thought I was doing a really good job and it just didn't hit the patient the way I had hoped. So with that said, we wanted to have a discussion and further the conversation about things that you can do to process those experiences and, more importantly, move forward and how to manage them.
So these have been really great examples of how each of us have responded in different ways to our personal rejections. Everybody responds differently. And when we face these professional rejections or professional failures, or however you want to word it, our initial reactions might be to internalize it. I'm a failure. What went wrong? I thought I prepared enough. Was I not good enough? Maybe even give up. Feel like question what you're doing, depending on how many times you're going through these different experiences. You may feel like maybe I'm not in the right field. Maybe I'm not cut out for this. What are some of the other, negative thoughts that kind of go through our heads that just kind of pull us down? And this can even include comparing ourselves to others who we perceive to be successful. We perceive that they've maybe had an easy, more linear trajectory through their career and not faced these types of things. And so this can contribute to us maybe losing our motivation. We might feel lost in moving forward. We might feel unsure or reduce our confidence in ourselves. And this impact can also be different for each person and how they experience it. So people, for example, who have faced historical barriers may experience rejection differently. People who have more inherent power or resources may be able to weather their failures or their rejections in a different way compared to people who may lack certain resources. So for example, a graduate student who's being supported by a spouse, that may be different for how they process this extra time and maybe not getting a training experience. Are they able to move forward with having an unpaid training experience? Or what are the impacts that this may have on their spouse? Or somebody who is perhaps, moved to a new city and doesn't have that support may not have the financial resources to, weather that storm and have that additional training time. So each of these can be really impactful in terms of how we react to our professional rejections. And then what do we do about it? How do we cope with these things? We know that we're often the worst at our own self-care. We're better generally at supporting others. And it's really okay. This is an okay time to sit with it. It doesn't feel good. And we're training to be psychologists, we're psychologists, but sometimes just sitting with our feelings can still feel really uncomfortable. But sitting with that reaction or that failure is all right to give yourself that extra time before you take next steps. And it's also important to remember that just because we're saying that this is a normal part of the career trajectory, that doesn't mean that you're not entitled to feel these feelings, to feel the sadness and the frustration, or whatever it is related to that rejection. This is also a really good time to remind yourself that professional life is only one part of your life. You have other things outside of the professional life that contribute to who you are. And while it's important to practice self-care regularly, during times in which we're facing these professional rejections, this is even more, it's gonna be particularly important to take time and remind ourselves of the things that bring us joy, that we enjoy doing, whether it's going for a hike or watching a sunset or being around friends and family, or maybe it's spending some alone time. Whatever that looks like for you, that can be really helpful in taking those necessary steps before you start planning what to do next.
So what to do next after you've sat with the feelings for a bit and kind of are ready to move on? You need some constructive input on what might have happened. So it's always a good idea to seek feedback in some form or other to try to understand maybe what happened. There are a wide variety of reasons as to why we might not be successful with a research endeavor, a clinical training application, or even our clinical work. One of the common sources of difficulty can be a gap in our training. Did we have the right combination of externship training experiences in preparation for that internship application? Did we have enough research experience to write a grant or to write that paper? Or giving feedback to patients? As I said, that is often one of the big areas of rejection for us. We don't hit the mark with our patients all the time. There can be poor communication, and as we know, that can look a lot of different ways. Was our CV put together in a coherent, organized way? Our letters, cover letters associated with our applications for training positions? Oral communication in an interview setting. Did we speak succinctly? Were we on target with our answers? And even our nonverbal communications. Sometimes it is the subtler things that we're not aware of about ourselves that can communicate a message that we didn't intend or that we weren't aware of. And even those small things can certainly play out in those training interviews, the job application interviews. Sometimes we are applying for a position or submitting that article to not quite the right journal. There can be a mismatch between our background, our training experiences, and we may have a wealth of training experiences, and we just didn't quite apply to the right setting that matched our particular backgrounds. So there can be a mismatch between what we bring to the table and what's being offered by that site in terms of a professional position or a training position, or what that branch of the NIH is looking for in a grant application. So an important step to that is seeking more mentorship and more supervision, helping us get that feedback in terms of what might have gone wrong. I think we can all resonate to that. Personally, I can reflect back to graduate school and my mentor. I was fortunate to have a very strong research-oriented mentor, and she encouraged me to write an NRSA pre-doc grant, and I was very excited. And she was always successful with her grads for many years, and I thought this, my young idealistic mind thought this was going to be fun, and worked really hard to submit that grant, and it was just more work than I could ever imagine. And I thought anything that had that much work involved should meet with success. Well, guess what? Not really. So I had submitted the grant, and while it had fared reasonably well, of course it was rejected, and there was lots of feedback associated with that. What do they call them? The pink sheets. I don't think they're pink anymore. I think it's all digital, but got that feedback and thought, oh, okay. All right. So I see the problems. Okay, I'm going to revise and resubmit. I was very fired up. I thought, okay, I know what to do now. They've given me the roadmap, so revise and resubmit. and no, got rejected again. So that was another little bit of a eye-opening experience. I revised it again and resubmitted and finally got that thing funded. But that was a very brutal experience. Anything that you put out there with that much work and blood, sweat, and tears, you just think it should be successful. And when it's not, when it's repeatedly not, it can be really a really traumatic experience, if you will. I don't know, perhaps some of you others have had some of these experiences.
That's a really good example. And I think when I'm looking at this different list of determining the reason for rejection, I can think about my own experience, not too dissimilar from Dr. Towns. I didn't match for internship. I was the only neuropsych person in my graduate program. It was a non-track program. And I progressed through my training program very quickly. I thought I had strong neuropsych training and I thought I was ready for internship. I had already defended my dissertation proposal. At that point I had already defended my dissertation. My dissertation was completed. And so I thought I had heard all these anecdotes from folks that if you've got your dissertation already completed, you're more competitive. And again, I had this false sense of kind of confidence walking into this process. And I was really taken aback when I didn't match for internship. And in hindsight, this is not anything negative towards my program. It was more of a realization of they didn't know what they didn't know. And it was really important for me to seek that outside mentorship from neuropsychology specific mentors. And what happened was I ended up contacting a program. It was about an hour and a half away. And I asked if they offered an externship. And they invited me to come for an interview. And because I'd already defended my dissertation, I was really embarrassed to admit or say anything that I hadn't matched for internship. But when I did share that, as soon as I did, it felt like the interview transitioned into, it felt like it transitioned from an interview into a mentorship session. And the director of clinical training and the supervisor were telling me, this is what you need to do. These are some of the gaps in your training, and really helped me to see more clearly what it is that I wanted, where I wanted to go, what the gaps were in the places that I had been and had trained, and what I needed to do. And that experience in helping me to reflect on those trainings and gaps was so impactful. They offered me an externship. I ended up matching the following year, matched for a postdoc. And this really taught me so much about the importance of support and mentorship and having different kinds of mentors. My graduate school was very supportive in the process, but they weren't necessarily as aware of what it looked like for neuropsychology specific training to be able to be competitive for the neuropsych match for internship. And so having that extra outside mentorship was really, really impactful. And the other thing that I often say that not matching for internship my first year was probably the best thing that has ever happened to my professional career, because it shaped the trajectory of how I ended up getting to where I am now. But more importantly, it taught me about the importance of being a mentor, being an advocate for students, and also the importance of transparency.
Dr. Towns, did you want to add a vignette to this?
Sure. I mean, there's so many examples of professional rejection for me. I absolutely can identify with what Dr. Dean was saying in terms of the importance of good mentorship and having someone else be able to offer you some perspective. I know that I actually failed my qualifying exam the first time around, which just broke my heart. I was a very good student academically. And what mine ended up being was really this example of poor communication. The expectations for the qualifying exam were a little bit vague. My cohort had all gotten together and decided that, we came up with an interpretation of the expectations. And then we all started working on our exams. They were take-home exams. And then finally somebody reached out, got clarification, and it turns out our expectations were totally wrong. And as a result, I had to start over and rushed it, didn't do a great job, and failed, which is just terrifying because I'm sure, like many of you, that meant that if I didn't pass the next year, I was out of the program. And so I was horrified and terrified. But to Dr. Dean's point, I also think it was kind of a turning point for me. I had been used to succeeding up to that point. I had gotten my master's degree and had done really well academically. And so that feeling of vulnerability and being able to overcome that was huge for me. And I also, it really changed, you know, I think the first time around, I submitted an okay qualifying exam, obviously didn't pass, so it wasn't great. But then the next year, my feedback was that it was one of the better qualifying exams they had ever seen because I had worked really, really hard. I think the same thing that you just said about internship, you know, my first year applying to internship, because I wasn't as qualified, I didn't apply to as many high quality programs. And I think that not matching was the best thing that ever happened to me, because then I took the extra year, worked really hard, and got a really amazing, what I would consider a very top tier internship. I chuckle because Dr. Dean and I did our internships at the same place. But you know, it was really telling. It was a really important formative experience. And had I matched that first year, I think I wouldn't have gotten the same quality of training.
These are all really great examples of each of these items, especially the intersection between poor communication and more mentorship. You can see poor communication can even be on our behalf. We didn't seek clarification. We didn't seek out what was intended by these vague instructions, whether it be a grant application or a training description. And we're good at making stuff up in our heads. And as it turns out, that wasn't such a good idea, but seeking that feedback was really important in terms of getting it right, as it were. So moving on from more mentorship and what that might look like, I just want to provide some other points on why we might be failure. Sometimes it has nothing to do with you. You can seek this mentorship, and everyone may look at your CV and your application and say, wow, you're a really strong candidate. You apply to the right sites. You have a good match between your training and the programs you applied to. But in this day and age with clinical training, there is just a math problem. There are just more applicants than training sites. So it might not have anything so directly to do with you, but that's important feedback as well. And hopefully it shores up your confidence to apply again. And something similar can be said about the research world. It may have been a fabulous grant. It may have been a fabulous paper that you put together, but funding streams being what they were, there may have been 99 fabulous research grants and they can only fund one. So just keep in mind that sometimes it's just a reflection of the times and the availability of resources, and it's not as much about you, but that process of seeking the mentorship and seeking feedback can help guide you in exactly that discrimination. Was it features of something about your application, your style, your credentials, or something about the environment? But more likely it's an intersection of all of these things. So moving on from there.
Yeah, so, you know, I think Dr. Morrison walked us through a lot of reasons why we might experience rejection. And sometimes there is no good reason other than there was a slightly more qualified applicant or there just wasn't enough grant money to go around. But, you know, I think one of the most important things when we think about, okay, we've sat with the rejection, we've gotten to a place where we can hear feedback, we've sought feedback and determined, you know, through that feedback, whether there was a gap somewhere or whether it was unfortunately just a lack of resources or whether it was poor communication. But once you get that feedback, then not only do you want to take corrective action, but you also want to build up your resistance. So one of the ways to reduce our vulnerability to this rejection is to build resilience. You know, and there's a quote on the PowerPoint here from, it was a qualitative study of K Award winners in academic medicine. And one of the major themes was rejection, but also the resilience that has to be developed to deal with that rejection, and how it does make for stronger clinicians and academic medicine faculty. And they said this ability to continue on. That's the thing that separates out the people who succeed in our field. There are plenty of talented, very smart people who didn't build up enough resilience to be able to overcome those rejections, to be able to bounce back, to be able to re-engage after feeling that rejection or that failure. And that really is something that causes, I mean, all of us and all of you, because you've made it this far, to stand apart. You know, and some ways to do this are seeking out mentors who can set an example for you, seeking out mentors who have faced similar challenges, seek out mentors who are willing to discuss their failures and rejections. You know, find supervisors who are willing to sort of talk you through their challenges. If you are a young working mom, you can always reach out and try and find a mentor who's the same and who's dealing with the same challenges of childcare. If you're an international student, finding mentorship or supervisors who have had to deal with the same hurdles. All of those things can be really, really helpful. And, you know, one thing that we can do for each other as supervisors, but also as students and trainees with our peers, is to normalize the rejection and the failure, knowing that it's something that we all go through, and that being transparent about this. And, you know, one other thing that I would say is it's important to pay attention to the difference between who you are and what you do. So, you know, Dr. Dean touched on this earlier, but we might have a tendency to internalize these rejections and say, well, I am a failure. I have been rejected. This supervisor marked up so much red on this report. The supervisor hates me. It's about, you know, it's me. And the reality is, no, it's your work. It's something that you do. It's really important, and it's a huge part of your life, but it isn't who you are. You know, a rejection of a grant isn't a rejection of you as a professional. And one of the, you know, I'm thinking about other ways to build resilience. And one of the best pieces of advice I ever got while I was going through internship was a supervisor said, apply for everything. And I was like, well, you know, there's this thing that I'm kind of thinking about, and I don't think I'm really a good candidate. She's like, apply for everything. And her point was kind of that it's go through it, get rejected. It's fine. It's a part of the process. And you don't always know. So I remember applying for something that I didn't think I was a great candidate for, which was student representative to the board of directors for AACN, actually. And I applied, and this supervisor wrote a letter in support of me that basically said, when I first started, she wasn't super keen on taking me on as a trainee. At the time, she didn't really like the concept of PsyD. It wasn't a really well accepted degree at the time. It was like less popular. And so she wrote about how she really wasn't psyched to take me on. But then obviously was writing this letter to say that she was impressed and pleased and that I did really well. And, you know, I wouldn't have even applied for that had she not given me the feedback of, yes, just go for everything, apply for everything, and sort of normalize that failure, go through it. I'd love to hear from the other panelists. Any suggestions or thoughts you have about other ways to build resilience?
Well, I love what you just said. And I was looking for an opportunity to expand on it. So I'm so glad that you brought that up. The apply for everything concept is wonderful, because you don't know what kind of feedback you're going to get from the apply for everything. Even if it is all quote unquote rejection, that's still information. Oh, we really thought you were strong, but this wasn't quite a good match. Or you were really strong, we didn't quite have enough slots. Please apply next year. So that rejection information is just as important as the success, to help you reframe how you're going to move forward. And in the spirit of seeking out mentorship and you know, that feedback, I'm thinking about all those situations, and the panelists discussed this before we got started with this, that not everyone is going to have in their immediate midst mentors who are in having a similar experience, of a similar background. And I would like to encourage all of you to look beyond the borders of your graduate training program, which, you know, cannot meet all the needs of all trainees. There are mentorship programs within our national organizations, whether it be AACN or HNS or any of the other organizations that are looking to help individuals from all backgrounds, diverse backgrounds, who have sort of unique experiences. And it might be more comfortable for some of you to speak to someone who's walking in similar shoes and can help you navigate those waters. So I would encourage, you know, we're harping on mentorship, and you're thinking about the faculty within your graduate program and thinking, well, there isn't really anybody, or the one person that you're supposed to get feedback from hasn't really been comfortable in discussing their own failures. So there are many opportunities out there. I just would encourage you to look broader to your professional organizations. Any of the national organizations, they're all interested in supporting our trainees in becoming professionals and helping our young junior professionals move through their careers. So there's a lot more opportunity out there than you think there is, all free. There's large groups of people looking to support you. And even when you go and seek that feedback, if I could circle back to another point for just a minute, going and asking that feedback, that's a really brave thing to do. That is just putting your heart and soul right in front of that person who is supposedly sitting there in judgment of you and asking, what did you do wrong? That is a very, very difficult thing. And that shows a lot of bravery on your part. It shows a lot of professionalism. It shows a lot of integrity. So even if you put yourself out there and you're seeking this feedback, and maybe you're encountering a mentor who's not as comfortable with providing feedback, it's still a win for you. And if I could share why, you have shown that supervisor, that mentor, that you are seeking improvement, that you are professional enough to recognize that you have growth edges, that you are mature enough to be able to go and do this hard thing. So I want to just remind you that just doing that is showing your strength and integrity and professionalism. And even if that supervisor is not able to quite meet you where you need to be met, you have still shown that supervisor quite a bit about your own resilience and professionalism. And even just having done that is really impactful.
Those are outstanding recommendations. And as I'm listening to both of you talk, I'm just sitting here nodding my head, because I can also think about either the trainees that I've encountered in which we've had those difficult conversations, or my own conversations that I had as a trainee, and how impactful those were. And we've been, sharing these experiences over the course of this talk. And I think the only thing that I have to add, which is a little bit cliche, but to look for the silver lining. You've heard several comments throughout the course of this about how these professional failures or rejections turned out to be the best thing that could have happened for our career. Of course, that's in hindsight. At the moment, you're sitting with it, and it feels horrible, and it feels terrible, and it feels embarrassing, and it feels lonely. But after you get through that initial hurdle, thinking about the silver linings of this, how is this going to strengthen you in your professional career? Is there an impact that you can have on a peer? Or is this something that's going to impact you as a supervisor in the future? Is this going to impact the conversations that you have with others? How is this going to shape your communication that you may have with your supervisors, or when you move on to your job? All of these different experiences are things that you can put into your backpack, if you will, or your briefcase to carry with you, that shape who you are and how you go on to practice and how you go on to supervise. And we really can't underscore the importance enough about mentorship and having different kinds of mentors to kind of help you navigate these different experiences.
As a final thought before Dr. Towns closes this out, I want to capstone what Dr. Dean just said. As the person who's been in, had just mathematically more years in the field amongst this group of panelists, I can say that my failures over the years have been good fodder for my supervision with my own trainees. And anybody who's worked with me will be able to tell you this. Most of what I'm sharing, especially in the clinical role of feedback to patients, writing reports, has a lot to do with where I crashed and burned badly. And, I bring that into the training experience. So just making it real, what Dr. Dean just said about your future communications. Literally, my future communications are, well, I don't write this anymore because I had patients unexpectedly react very badly to this. And I learned how that style or that way of phrasing it really did not hit home. And I had a very bad clinical experience because I didn't do a good job. And so this is what shaped my current writing. And this is why I'm making you revise that phrasing or whatever it is. So I hope that even though you're not yet in the supervisory role, that you take these experiences and, as Dr. Dean says, in your backpack, carry them forward, and please consider sharing the good, bad, and the ugly with your future colleagues and trainees.
Absolutely. And, I think it's so important to remember that, professional resilience is important and it can be built, but it's also very transferable. I think that when we become people who can persevere in the face of a challenge, it doesn't necessarily restrict itself to one avenue. I remember getting feedback from a supervisor once that my brand new car, I had just gotten a new car, and it was hit while it was parked and totaled like a week after I got it. And I remember my supervisor saying, "Gosh, you're just unflappable. I can't get over how well you're dealing with this." And I was like, well, I've been in graduate school for a while. So, I think that even though we say what you do is not who you are, but what you do what you go through professionally does change who you are, and it does make a difference, and it does create a more resilient person, a person who can persevere through other things. We get a lot of insights when we hit these failure points. I know that when I didn't match for internship, I had made plans for self-care, and I was going to go see my sisters, and I was going to spend time with my sisters. And I got there and realized, you know what? I wish that I were spending this time with my boyfriend. And that was one of the first times that I realized that my boyfriend was probably going to become my husband. Was that, that's when I had a failure, that's where I wanted to be. That had become my safe place. So it's a very personal story, but it I think illustrates how building these skills and having these growth experiences can make a huge difference in our lives, and can really help us move forward and grow and succeed, and hopefully continue to develop. I think one thing that I want to emphasize is that as we wrap up, that all of the panelists can probably agree with, is that this process doesn't stop after you're a trainee. We all are still continuing to experience professional rejections and professional failures, and we continue to grow through them, and that's how we develop, and those are some of our greatest learning moments. So I hope this was really helpful for everyone to learn a little bit about professional rejection and failure, hopefully get some ideas about how to cope with it, and hopefully this presentation will come to mind when you do have to cope with some of those things. And we hope that this has been valuable. Please feel free to reach out to the Student Affairs Committee at any time. We have an email address, theaacnsac@gmail.com. And we also have a fantastic mentoring program that's designed for trainees of all levels that would be happy to match you with a mentor that meets your specific needs. So please visit the AACN students page if you're interested in signing up for that. Thank you so much for joining us.